Normally, it's hard for celebrities and well-known people to go anywhere without being recognized, but every now and then, a famous person manages to vanish without a trace. In October 2023, Filipino schoolteacher and beauty pageant contestant Catherine Camelon vanished under suspicious circumstances. Despite 2 people being charged in relation to her disappearance, Catherine still remains missing over a year and a half later. Catherine became a local celebrity during the pandemic when she won the Binibining Batangas quarantine contest. She'd been working as a school teacher since graduating from university and used her platform in the contest to advocate for essential workers. After the early success, Catherine continued to enter beauty pageants and worked as a model alongside her career as a teacher. She was recognized in both professions. In 2021, she received an award for her work in the classroom, and 2 years later, she won the Miss FIT Philippines contest and the Miss Grand Tui title. In 2023, she was an entrant into the Miss Grand Philippines competition but did not place. Just 3 months later, she would disappear. Catherine was last seen on October 12, 2023. She was supposed to be in Batangas City to meet with the online Balisong channel, a company she'd done work for in the past. But according to the company, she never made it to their offices, and they hadn't seen her in person since 2021. Catherine was captured on CCTV at a mall in Lemery, where she met up with a coworker. At about 8 p.m. that evening, she talked to her mother on the phone and told her she was already at a gas station in Buan. When Catherine didn't make it home, her mother and sister grew worried. They contacted authorities the same day and appealed for information on social media. Catherine had been driving a gray Nissan Juke at the time of her disappearance. This was a clue that helped uncover more information about what may have happened to her. Witnesses came forward to report seeing that car and Catherine. According to witnesses, 3 men had transferred Catherine's unconscious body from the Nissan to a red Honda. Catherine looked like she'd been attacked before being moved. It wasn't long before the police found the vehicle in question. Inside, they found hair strands and other DNA evidence which were matched to Catherine. Suspicion soon fell on Police Major Alan De Castro. During questioning, De Castro confessed to being in a romantic relationship with Catherine, despite the fact that he was married and had a family. De Castro later retracted the confession and denied having any involvement with the missing woman. The police are treating Catherine's disappearance as a kidnapping case, but they're yet to find any trace of her remains. Both the authorities and Catherine's family have appealed for anyone with information to come forward to try to solve the mystery and bring Catherine home. Crosby Garston was an accomplished writer and artist who disappeared under strange circumstances in April of 1930. While most believed he lost his life in the Salcombe estuary in Devon, England, rumors continued for decades that he had intentionally disappeared and was living a new life out of the public eye. Garston was the son of another artist, Norman Garston. He showed artistic talent at a young age and would model for his father and other artists. But his skills as a painter weren't enough for him as an artist. He traveled around the world to try different work. He worked as a prospector and bronco buster in the US and a lumberjack in Canada. His father sent him to South Africa, where he worked on a cattle ranch and acted as a bushranger. During the First World War, he returned to Europe to serve in a cavalry regiment. He saw combat and was recognized in his regiment for his skill in the saddle, even if cavalry forces weren't as important in this war as in previous conflicts. It was around this time that Garston's work started to get attention. He wrote comic poetry about his experiences on the front, which were publicized in Punch magazine. Later collections of his work would be published, and he gained more recognition as a comedic writer. Garston continued his adventures after the war. He traveled around the world, at first for research for his novels. In the 1920s, he published his most famous work, the Penhale Trilogy, about a Cornish hero from the 1800s. But Garston also wrote about his travels in a non-fiction format, which gained him more work as a travel writer. Whether fiction or non-fiction, Garston's work was highly praised. His adventure stories found an enthusiastic audience in America. His final book was China Seas, which was described as a romantic adventure. His disappearance happened just days after Johnston submitted the manuscript for China Seas. On the night of April 18th, he'd gone to a dance at the Salcombe Hotel in Devon. He enjoyed himself into the early morning hours and left the hotel with an actress and a deckhand. They headed to a friend's yacht, which was moored 50 yards offshore. The three piled onto an inflatable dinghy in the relatively peaceful Salcombe estuary and set off. But while they were still some distance from the yacht, a swell caused the dinghy to tip over. Johnston was a strong swimmer and decided to head towards the yacht rather than back to shore. The actress and deckhand swam back to dry land, and both made it, but Johnston was never seen again. In 1988, a reverend came forward saying he'd worked with someone calling himself Crosby Johnston in the 1960s. This man claimed to have written under pen names and listed two authors who were active between 1931 and 1960. But as there was no way to contact this mysterious man, there's no way to verify his claim, and this mystery will likely never be solved. Doing research into family history can sometimes turn up some strange facts, and even unsolved mysteries. This is what a golf course designer found when he tried to look into his grandfather. Clement Bernard Johnston Sr. was born sometime around 1895, likely in Wisconsin. He had a talent for sports. Unlike a lot of sports people, Johnston didn't dedicate himself to a single sport. While at North Carolina's Wake Forest University, he played football, basketball, and baseball. Johnston seemed to have reasonable success on the field, but he wasn't destined for a career as a professional player. Instead, he attended a coaching school, studying under Fielding Harris Yost. After graduating, he coached at a North Carolina high school and later the Clarkston Tech College in New York. In 1928, he began a new adventure. He returned to North Carolina, this time as the head coach at Appalachian College. According to the university's 1930 yearbook, it was an uphill fight for Johnston. The football team, the Mountaineers, had only been formed a few years earlier and still had a lot to learn. But throughout the season, the team showed clear improvements. The same yearbook stated that contributory factors in the team's success may be traced to the development of an environment of victory, an insistent spirit of sportsmanship, and manifest enthusiasm for the game. The factors were areas where Johnston would have played an important part, and he was thanked shortly afterwards. The Appalachian College also saw success in the basketball team coached by Johnston. It was just the beginning of Johnston's coaching career. Given his early success, it's easy to believe he could have gone on to become one of the most important coaches of the era. But in 1932, he was fired from the job for playing an ineligible player. Between 1932 and 33, he traveled to Norfolk, where he visited his wife's sister. When he left, he told her he was going home to pick up his inheritance. The last known location of C.B. Johnston was Zanesville, Ohio. He sent a postcard to his wife, telling her he was going to Chicago to publish a book, but he was never seen or heard from again. Years later, members of the Wake Forest golf team claimed to have spotted him at games in Florida, but it's unclear if this was actually Johnston or not. Unfortunately, further research into Johnston didn't answer the mystery. It was also found that his early life was just as mysterious as his later years. While his marriage certificate and his children's birth certificates indicated he was born in Wisconsin, that might not have been the case. There was evidence that he attended school in Missouri under another name and may have changed his name to Clement Bernard so he could attend university for a second time. With only a list of names from the earlier school, rather than any actual school photos, it was impossible to say for certain. But it's possible that Johnston had changed his name once before, and may have done so again to try to start a new life after vanishing without a trace. Unless someone else researching their own family history discovers some dark secrets about a great-grandfather or older relative, likely the answer to Johnston's disappearance will never be found. Kota Ramaswamy came from an important cricket family in India. Even in the 1930s, it would have been difficult for him to stand out among his successful relatives, including a father who was known as the father of South Indian cricket. Ramaswamy did just that with an impressive sports career, but he unfortunately became known for another part of his life, his mysterious disappearance in October of 1985. Ramaswamy was born in Madras, India in 1896. He was the youngest son of Buchi Babu Naidu, a cricketer who made the sport popular in the country. As Naidu promoted the sport to other Indians, his own sons also became interested in the game. Both of Ramaswamy's brothers also went into the sport. Ramaswamy himself played at a young age, but when he went to Cambridge University to study, his attention was turned to a different sport. He swapped the bat for a racket and took up tennis, winning competitions around the country. In 1922, he represented India on the international stage in the Davis Cup, making it through to the second round. That same year, he played in the Wimbledon Championships. When he finished his studies, Ramaswamy returned to the sport he became famous for. He played first-class cricket until 1942, when he was well into his 40s. In 1936, he was selected for the Indian cricket team's tour of England and made his first Test match appearance at the age of 40. It made him the second oldest Indian to make this Test match debut. Ramaswamy saw himself as past his prime at this point and believed he'd been selected for non-cricket seasons. That didn't help him from putting in an impressive performance, scoring 40 and 60 on debut. The matches also made him one of only 4 Indian cricketers to have played internationally in another sport. After retiring as a player, Ramaswamy remained an important figure in cricket circles. He managed the Indian cricket team as they played in the West Indies in 1952 and 53, and also worked as a selector. Ramaswamy continued to give interviews to sports writers, even as late as 1984, when he was well into his 80s. According to one journalist, he spoke confidently about his experience as a player and as a selector. He needed to be prompted for some memories, but didn't appear to have any mental health issues or significant physical health problems that might have prompted his disappearance. The disappearance came on October 15, 1986. He left his home in Adyar, where he lived with his wife, and simply never returned. Unfortunately, there's no details about what Ramaswamy was wearing at the time of his disappearance, or where he may have intended to go. His family reported him missing shortly after, and a search for the famous cricketer began. Some believe Ramaswamy intentionally disappeared. He was 89 years old at the time, and may have wanted to avoid being a burden to his family. For years afterward, there were reported sightings of the celebrity sportsman, but none could be confirmed. Cricket record books listed him as having presumably passed away, but this was stopped after 1991. More recent record books have him listed as passing away in January of 1990. In historical times, it would have been simple for someone to slip away from everyone who knew them, never to be seen again. Even someone relatively well known in one area might be able to live completely anonymously elsewhere. In the 1860s, astronomer Thomas John Hussey managed to do just that, vanishing without a trace. Today, Hussey is best remembered for his connection to the discovery of Neptune. From a young age, he'd been interested in the stars. He studied divinity at university and became a rector in 1831. The locals noted that he was an eccentric. One of the first things he did after moving into the rectory was to build an observatory so he could study the night sky. It was an exciting time for anyone with an interest in astronomy. Only a few years before Hussey was born, Uranus was discovered. It was the first time since ancient times that a new planet had been found. Hussey was one of many amateur astronomers studying the new planet closely. He also made detailed drawings of sunspots, and in 1835 became a local celebrity when he became the first Englishman to see the return of Halley's Comet. Like many astronomers, he noted that there seemed to be something strange about Uranus's orbit. It was moving a lot slower than the laws of gravity suggested it should be. Many different theories for this were put forward. Some believed that there might be a hidden substance in the far reaches of the solar system that was slowing down the planet. Others thought that Newton's law of gravity might not be as correct as they assumed. Hussey had a different idea. In 1834, he wrote to George Bedell Airy, the most important British astronomer at the time, and suggested another planet was responsible for Neptune's irregular orbit. He believed the gravitational pull of another mass could explain why the planet was slowing down. Hussey asked Airy to do the calculations to figure out where this mass would be, and he would look into that area to try to spot the planet. Airy didn't completely dismiss the idea, but thought it was impossible to calculate based on the information they had. He told Hussey it would take many orbits of Uranus before they could figure it out, which would take centuries. Hussey seemingly dropped the idea. Thankfully, he wasn't the only person to have this idea. 10 years later, astronomers would observe Neptune for the first time, working off of calculations by Urbain Jean-Joseph Le Verrier. By this time, a medical condition meant Hussey had to give up his astronomy and was focused on his family and church. He had a wife and 3 children, but in 1853, his wife passed away. It's not clear how Hussey reacted to the tragedy, but it wasn't long after that he would vanish. In March of 1854, Hussey was giving a typical sermon at the church when he suddenly stopped. He told his parish that he would have to finish the following week and quickly left. But the next week, there was no sign of Hussey, and he wasn't seen in England again. He told his family he was moving to the Algiers, apparently offering no explanation. They wouldn't hear from him until 1866 when he wrote to tell him that he was now serving in Paris. The Hussey children tried to get in contact with their father for years. They put adverts in newspapers in the Algiers and Paris area, hoping to get him to contact them, but they got no response. In 1893, he was legally declared as having passed away, but there were still no answers to the mystery, which remains unsolved to this day. The late spring and early summer of 1998 was a tumultuous time for Indonesia. The regime of President Suharto was on the brink of collapse, and protests were taking place across the country. In the midst of this, famous writer and activist Wiji Tukul was hiding from military authorities, but he still took part in protests. He was last seen in April of 1998, only a month before Suharto's resignation. But as Indonesia moved into a new post-New Order era, Tukul was nowhere to be found. Tukul had started writing poetry at a young age. Even as a child, the poetry took a more political stance, as he wrote about what life was like for the people around him. He was born in central Java in 1963, and had to drop out of school early due to his family's financial situation. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence for people in Tukul's community. While Tukul tried odd jobs to make a living, he continued to write and read a lot. At first, he performed his poetry as a busker, interacting with his audience in the street. That helped to share the ideas of revolution and resistance that Tukul gradually became more and more involved with. Tukul's work became more and more well-known, at first in his local community, and then wider afield. He attended poetry conventions, often without an invite, as the organizers weren't happy with the messages his work promoted. But even that didn't stop people from coming to listen to his work and chanting along to his poems. By the late 1990s, Tukul was one of the key voices in the movement against the Suharto regime. Suharto had been president of Indonesia since 1967. Opposition was extremely restricted, which meant that everything Tukul was doing put him and his family at risk. In 1996, he became an important figure in the newly founded People's Democratic Party. It was a move his wife opposed. Even forming a new party was illegal, and she believed he could continue spreading his message through his poems alone. That didn't stop Tukul, though. He continued to attend demonstrations. In one, he was attacked by a law enforcement officer. His eye was wounded, and he was left with damaged eyesight. In July of 1996, the party's offices were raided and a riot broke out. Important party members had to go into hiding. That included Tukul. But even while he was on the run from government forces, he continued to write and publish poems, often under a pseudonym. He kept up with the news and what was going on at the time. When he learned of a raid at his home, he wrote a poem thanking the authorities for showing his young children what they were like. While on the run, he kept in touch with his family as often as he could. The last time he contacted his wife was in February 1998. He was in Jakarta and was preparing to meet with other activists. She expected he would be in touch soon enough, but another message never came. A few months later, witnesses spotted Tukul at a protest in Tangerang near Jakarta. Nobody at the time realized that he would never be seen again. In May, Suharto retired. There was hope that those who were hiding would now be free to come back and try to lead an ordinary life, but Tukul never reappeared. Many feared that he'd been kidnapped by government forces before the new order ended. In the final 2 years of Suharto's premiership, dozens of people were kidnapped. Many were released, but to this day at least 13 people remain missing. For decades, Takul's friends and family have been joined by charities in demanding answers for his mysterious disappearance. Unfortunately, none of those answers have come to light. Bob Limburn was a Canadian Olympic skier whose career was cut short after a devastating accident. Decades after he last attempted a jump, Limburn walked into the woods and vanished without a trace. Exactly when and where he was last seen are just as mysterious as what happened to him afterwards. Limburg was born in Ontario in 1909, but moved to Revelstoke, British Columbia when he was just 2 years old, at the base of Mount McPherson. It wasn't until Limburg was 13 that he first put on skis. Limburg made a name for himself in cross-country skiing. He's believed to have made the first ski ascent to Mount Begby in May of 1932. He left town at 4 a.m. and reached the glacier 4 hours later, and from there the ascent was mostly on his skis. Though as he approached the summit, he reported having to take them off so he could get a better foothold. He reached the summit by 1 p.m. and returned safely to town by that evening. Unfortunately, Limburg would never make it to the 1936 Olympic Games as he had originally planned. In 1935, he had an accident while training and suffered a concussion. The consequences of the accident meant that Limburg would never compete again. The wound would cause problems for Limburg for the rest of his life, but he turned his focus to a new career. He joined the Canadian Pacific Railroad as a fireman. During the Second World War, his company was sent to Britain to operate the British railway system. In 1944, Limburg served in France, helping to repair and maintain railroads near the front before turning them over to civilian operators. After the war, he continued to work at CPR, but problems from his earlier accident continued to plague him. Exactly when Limburg disappeared isn't easy to determine. According to the Canadian Military Engineers Association, the incident took place in 1957. The last appearance of Limburg in any newspapers came in that year when he made an appearance at an event that was photographed with the Revelstoke Ski Club president. If the CMEA is accurate, shortly after his photo was taken, Limburg would vanish. He simply walked into the woods and never came out. According to those who knew him, he'd been acting strangely shortly before the disappearance. Unfortunately, the details of the story are murky. Which woods is unclear, but Limburg's family members did confirm that the story was true. No remains were ever found. John Lake was a successful sports writer, preparing to ghostwrite a book for a baseball great, and sports editor for one of the largest magazines in the country. But after a strange weekend in December of 1967, Lake disappeared and was never seen again. Lake was 37 years old at the time of his disappearance, living in Manhattan. He got his start in journalism 15 years earlier when he worked on the sports desk of a local newspaper. In 1959, he got a job at the New York Herald Tribune, and 5 years later moved to Newsweek, where he took up the role of sports editor. Lake was very diligent in his job, often receiving praise from the sports stars he was interviewing. He took his work seriously, which only made the events of December 10, 1967, even stranger. Years earlier, Lake had separated from his wife, Alice, and moved out of the family home in New Jersey. For a while, he stayed with friends, or with his girlfriend, Jean, who lived in New York. But by the time of his disappearance, it seemed like he was ready to start the next phase in his life. He was renting an apartment in Manhattan, and had recently agreed to proceed with the divorce. This was surprising to his wife, as he'd been very resistant to the idea previously. Lake's friends noted that he seemed to be worried about money. He told them he'd have to do freelance work on top of his work for Newsweek to keep up with expenses. He'd also recently been hired to ghostwrite a book for baseball player Bob Gibson. Lake filed his final copy for Newsweek on Saturday, December 9th. Later that evening, Lake was supposed to meet with the PR man for the Kansas City Chiefs, along with another sports journalist. The second journalist showed up at the meeting, but there was no sign of Lake. That was extremely odd, but neither man realized how significant the missed meeting was at the time. The next day, Lake called several people. He was trying to find someone to hang out with, but friends and acquaintances all turned him down. His girlfriend was away for the weekend, so it wasn't an option. In the end, he spent the evening with a woman named Sandy. She was a nurse and was described as a friend of a friend. The pair had dinner at a restaurant, and Lake had several drinks. According to later news reports, Lake may have had a problem with alcohol, but he wasn't too drunk when Sandy last saw him. Lake and Sandy took a cab to her apartment. He asked if he could come inside, but Sandy turned him down, as she had to get up early for work. She suggested he take the cab home, but Lake told her he would get the subway. It should have been a short walk to the nearest subway station, but it wasn't clear if Lake ever made it there. Despite the strange events of the weekend, it was 4 days before Lake was reported missing. It was his wife Alice who filed the police report. Unfortunately, there was little attention at the time. His co-workers at Newsweek believed he had intentionally disappeared. It seemed like the pressure of the job had gotten to him, and this was why he had vanished. But Lake left behind 2 young children, as well as a girlfriend he seemed happy with. Newsweek eventually hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to try to get to the bottom of the mystery, but no new information was found. Decades later, Lake's son, Eric, took the investigation into his own hands. A police officer in New York sent a photo of a John Doe whose remains were found in February of 1968, 2 years after Lake disappeared. There were similarities between the unidentified man and the missing sports journalist, but Eric couldn't say for certain if it was his father. Unfortunately, the man had to be buried in Hart Island potter fields, and DNA was unavailable, and the case remains unsolved. In just 43 years, Thomas Francis Meagher experienced more than most people would in their entire lives. He first rose to fame, leading rebellions in Ireland, was sent to a penal colony in Tasmania, and escaped to the US. But after making a name for himself during the American Civil War, Meagher vanished without a trace, likely beneath the surface of the rushing Missouri River on July 1st of 1867. Meagher was born in Ireland to a well-off family. He was able to get a good education, where he developed public speaking skills that would make him famous, or infamous in years to come. While he was still young, Meagher became involved with the Young Ireland movement, which was fighting for Ireland's independence from the United Kingdom. In 1848, he traveled to France and returned with a tricolor flag made by a French seamstress. Over a century later, this would evolve into the flag used by the newly formed Irish Republic. But at the time, the rebellion was not successful. Meagher was arrested and found guilty of sedition. Initially, his sentencing cost him his life, but this was commuted to transportation for life to Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. For most, this would be the end of the story, but Meagher didn't spend the rest of his life doing hard labor in a penal colony. In 1852, he escaped and traveled to the US. His exploits in Ireland had already made him famous, or infamous. He continued to give talks about Irish liberation and attracted attention from like-minded Irishmen who traveled to the US by more direct means. When the US Civil War broke out, he was instrumental in enlisting other Irish immigrants to the Union cause. Meagher enlisted himself and supported abolishing slavery. He helped to recruit the 69th Infantry Regiment, or the Fighting 69 as they became known, and later the Irish Brigade. He fought in many battles and retired as a highly decorated general. After the war, he was given the governorship of the territory of Montana after the last governor fled the area. It was a controversial appointment, especially as Meagher encouraged other Irish immigrants to settle in the area and advocated for voting rights for African American veterans. But one of the biggest problems Meagher faced was vigilante justice. Vigilante groups had steadily been on the rise in Montana and were the main groups opposing Meagher's rule. On top of politics, he would intervene in low cases where he thought the evidence didn't line up with the verdict, and had at least one person pardoned for a crime he believed was self-defense. The person lost his life at the hands of the vigilante militia. By 1867, Meagher was looking to bring an end to his political career. After a life in the spotlight, he was looking forward to a quiet life in retirement. His last job as governor was acquiring some weaponry to help defend against Native American attacks. He was traveling by steamboat to Fort Benton with the weaponry when he fell ill. Meagher's sickness meant he had to stop for several days, but even when the journey got going again, he was still sick. On July 1st, the ship was docked at Fort Benton. A sentry on board recalled seeing a figure in white clothing wander towards the rear of the ship, where the bathroom was. Moments later, he heard a splash and immediately shouted that there was a man overboard, but he didn't jump in himself. The river was flowing at roughly 10 miles an hour and was 12 feet deep at this point. He didn't believe he would survive the jump. As Meagher was nowhere to be found, it was assumed that he was the person who'd fallen overboard. His body was never found. Immediately, conspiracy theories began to circulate. Meagher had his fair share of enemies, and there was at least one figure on board the ship who was a member of the vigilante group. Some suspected the vigilantes, while others believed the British or a Native American group was to blame for the fall. As Meagher was never found, it's unlikely the mystery will ever be solved. Mario Rossi was a pioneer in his field, achieving plenty of victories in NASCAR Grand National racing, and making the sport safer for the drivers. But over the New Year period in 1983, Rossi vanished in extremely suspicious circumstances. Rossi was a mechanic and engineer who worked in NASCAR for decades. He was fascinated by machines from an early age and built his first engine when he was just 7 years old. He operated an automotive shop in his hometown of Trenton, New Jersey, but Rossi was drawn to a more competitive career. In 1955, he joined the NASCAR Grand National Championship. Rossi primarily worked behind the scenes as a mechanic and engineer, but in the mid-1950s, he made some one-off appearances behind the wheel. In 1956, he made his racing debut at Langhorne, but was unable to finish. 2 years later, he was driving again, this time in 2 events. Rossi didn't impress much on the track, but as someone who worked with cars themselves, he excelled. In 1968, Rossi started his own team, Rossi Engineering, working with drivers like Bobby Allison. Over the next 4 years, the team scored 5 victories and many other podium finishes. He found new, innovative ways to make everything from the cars to the pit stops faster. One of his innovations was gluing the lug nuts to the wheel of the car, something that every NASCAR team does now. But speed wasn't Rossi's only priority. He was involved in the sport at a very dangerous time. In the 60s, Joe Weatherby and Billy Wade lost their lives in accidents on the track. Rossi made 2 significant changes. The first was installing headrests in his cars. The second was the 5-point harness, which includes a strap between the legs to stop the buckle from flying upwards in an accident. Unfortunately, Rossi wasn't as good a businessman as he was an engineer, and he had to give up the team and sell the equipment. For a while, he went back to work for another team, but a falling out with the driver meant he left NASCAR behind him for good. Rossi continued to work with engines and found a new interest in racing boat motors. As Rossi's racing career came to an end, it looked like his work to improve safety would be what he was most remembered for, but that changed in the first few days of 1983. Rossi spent 1982 living in the Bahamas. His daughter came to stay with them for a while, but some of the activities that Rossi was allegedly involved in didn't sit right with her, and she returned to the U.S. Rossi flew back to New Jersey to spend Christmas with his mother and siblings, but wanted to be back home for the New Year. On the morning of December 29th, a family member drove him to Philadelphia International Airport and said goodbye. It was the last time any of his family would ever see or hear from him. A few days later, Rossi's sister tried to call him to wish him a Happy New Year, but he didn't answer the phone. This wasn't immediately worrying. On January 2nd, though, it was clear something was wrong. A woman calling herself Betty phoned Rossi's family. She claimed to be a girlfriend and had called to tell them Rossi had lost his life in a plane accident. Rossi was a skilled pilot, so the story already didn't make sense. Things only became stranger when the authorities could find no evidence of a crash. Rossi's family believed the crash story was false, but there was no denying that he was missing. His family were warned not to go to the authorities, which led to rumors that Rossi may have been involved with smuggling illegal substances. Others thought he may have gone into witness protection, but no records of Rossi working with the authorities were ever found. If alive today, Rossi would be in his 90s. Many fans of the show NCIS New Orleans would be surprised to learn that Zoe McClellan, one of the stars of the show, has been missing since April of 2019, and that a warrant has been issued for her arrest as a result. Strangely, the case didn't make any headlines after Zoe, who was 46 at the time, disappeared with her then 6-year-old son, Sebastian. Hence, many of her fans are only now learning why she hasn't appeared in any other TV shows or made any public appearances for years. Jean-Pierre Guy Gillian, Zoe's husband and Sebastian's father, has opened up to media outlets about the case, stating that he's not seen either of them since April of 2019, and hence she's been charged with kidnapping, since she didn't inform the boy's father that she was planning on leaving. While neither of their whereabouts is known, it's assumed that Zoe and Sebastian are together. Gillian has speculated that they might be somewhere near New Orleans in Louisiana, since he was told by someone close to him that this was the case, though he didn't divulge who he heard this rumor from or how this source obtained this information. But this is not the first time that Zoe has had issues with Sebastian's custody, since she was accused by Gillian of kidnapping in 2018, when she and the boy moved to Canada without informing him. But in that instance, the move was not found to constitute kidnapping, and the charge was ultimately dropped. She also stated that the move was very necessary, since she'd landed a role on the TV drama Designated Survivor, for which she had to relocate to Toronto. The judge overseeing the case stated that both Zoe and Gillian knew that, because of the nature of her work, she may have to travel outside of Los Angeles, and hence she cannot be expected to obtain permission every single time. He added that the boy would be cared for in a more stable environment where he'd travel with his mother, rather than living with his father. This came after the couple went through a tough and chaotic divorce that then resulted in a custody dispute. While this battle was still ongoing, Zoe and Sebastian suddenly disappeared and have not been seen or heard from since. Following this, Gillian posted to social media for anyone with information on their whereabouts to come forward, adding that Zoe was wanted for kidnapping. Zoe's also wanted for child custody deprivation, since Gillian would have been granted permission to see his son regardless of the outcome of the custody hearing, and since the pair is nowhere to be found, he's been deprived of this privilege. But the case also contains accusations from Zoe that Gillian was abusive towards their son while they were married, specifically between 2014 and 2016. At the time, he was taken into custody and hit with 2 charges that we can't even mention here. But Gillian stated that these charges were false and malicious, and he expressed his surprise at how well Zoe had planned to have him arrested on charges that, according to him, are complete fabrication. An investigation into the allegations was conducted, but due to a lack of evidence, the charges against Gillian were eventually dropped, but he did remain incarcerated for 4 months while the case was ongoing. Many of Zoe's fans are left wondering if she'll ever be seen again, and whether she'll be able to identify her actions in court if she's ever tracked down by the authorities. Frank Morris, along with 2 brothers, Clarence and John Anglin, have attained celebrity status since they famously escaped from Alcatraz prison in 1962, becoming the first and only inmates to ever breach the prison's walls without either being caught or losing their lives in the water that surrounds Alcatraz Island. There is, of course, much speculation about whether the 3 men ever made it to land alive, but many people feel that this is the case, and that they managed to live out their lives without ever being tracked down by the law. Guards at the prison only realized that the 3 were gone when they conducted their rounds on the morning of the 12th of June of that year. They were fooled into thinking that the inmates were soundly asleep in their beds, since the escapees left papier-mâché heads on their pillows. The 2 Anglin brothers were serving time at the prison after they were apprehended following a bank robbery, whereas Morris had been in a different prison for robbery, but he escaped, and when he was eventually apprehended, he was sent to Alcatraz with yet another burglary charge added to his sentence. When the escape was discovered, the resulting investigation revealed that the 3 men had been planning it for about 6 months, starting by loosening the air vents in their cells, allowing them enough room to crawl through. They then managed to get their hands on about 50 raincoats, and from these they constructed a raft and life preservers, following instructions that they had discovered in a magazine. Next, they fashioned a pair of paddles or oars, as well as a tool that could be used to inflate the raft once they were ready to get into the icy water. When the night came to make their escape, they climbed to a ventilator in the prison's roof via a series of pipes. After bending open the ventilator, they made it outside and climbed down a bakery smokestack, climbing over the fence without being spotted by guards, and they made their way to the northeastern side of the island. Here, they inflated their makeshift raft and launched it into the San Francisco Bay, which was thoroughly searched after their escape was noticed, but to no avail. Authorities were certain that they would find the three men's remains in the water, but this was not the case. The investigation into the escape was eventually closed in 1979, with the FBI admitting that they had no idea whether the men had survived, and if so, where they went upon reaching the mainland of San Francisco. Ken and David Widener, nephews of the Anglin brothers, have since revealed a photo that they claim shows John and Clarence very much alive in 1975, 13 years after the escape. The family believes the brothers made it to Brazil, where they started new lives as farmers. They also believe that the photo was taken and sent to the family as proof that the brothers were not only alive but doing well, but they could of course never go back home for fear of being arrested again. The image has been scrutinized by experts, none of whom could agree whether or not it showed John or Clarence. As for Morris, no evidence has ever surfaced that he's alive, but it's believed that if the two brothers survived the escape, he likely did too. Giuseppe Andrews, the well-known actor, director, and screenwriter, was born Joey Murcia Jr. He made his first Hollywood appearance in 1999, when he played the part of a character named Rex in the film Detroit Rock City. He also appeared in the famous horror film Cabin in the Woods and the romantic comedy Never Been Kissed, and was featured in 2 music videos by the band The Smashing Pumpkins for their songs 1979 and Perfect. As a director, he became known for strange and often unsettling films, most of which were independent productions or experimental projects. His style of filmmaking is often likened to John Waters and Harmony Korine due to their unique nature. But his origins as a director were not easygoing. When he was starting out in the film industry, he mostly lived in trailer parks and would often recruit his fellow residents to appear in his films, along with their caravans. He and his father spent some time living in a van before they got a break and were cast in an infomercial. From here, Giuseppe was able to find further acting work, and his love for the industry became clear. His fellow filmmakers have often touted him as being wholly original, since his films are easily recognizable as his, purely thanks to the style that he prefers. But he isn't just an actor and director. He's also released some of his own music, not under a label, but as an independent artist. He released his first album named Giants in 2006, and he followed this up by producing a further 15 albums, some of the titles being Race Cars, Night Owl, and Waiting Room. The last of his albums, an EP called Sumami, was released in 2010, and while his music may not be at the top of the charts, he's amassed a small following over the years, with many people being appreciative of his unique ideas when producing music. But these days, Andrew's life is shrouded in mystery. By 2015, he was seen by as a spiritualist and poet, and his body of work started to attract a cult following. But then he suddenly disappeared without explanation. All of his social media accounts have been deactivated, and he left no clue as to where he planned to go, or why he decided to suddenly vanish. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a lot of speculation, with some people believing he suffered a mental breakdown and decided to retreat to a life of solitude. Others think he may have passed away since he was last seen, but no evidence supporting this theory has ever been found. And for now, Andrews' whereabouts, as well as the state of his well-being, remain unknown. In June of 1995, then 27-year-old Jody Hoysen-Truitt was working as a CBS affiliate, KIMTV news anchor in Iowa while living in Mason City. Her career was on the right track, and by all appearances her life was going according to plan. But on the morning of the 27th of June that year, she failed to show up for work, and when her coworkers were unable to get a hold of her, they contacted the police. Investigators traveled to Jody's apartment, and there they discovered evidence that a struggle had taken place outside the building and her vehicle. It became apparent that she vanished before setting out to work that morning, since her car was still parked in its usual spot. No one has seen or heard from Jody since, but her case remains open, as investigators hope to find some answers one day. During the resulting investigation, Jody's coworkers told investigators that she usually arrived at the station at around 3:30 a.m. every morning, and then started making preparations for the 6 a.m. news broadcast. The newsroom's producer, Amy Kunz, stated that whenever Jody hadn't arrived by 4 a.m., she would call her to wake her up, which was the case that morning. Jody said she was getting up and that she would be at the station shortly. But by 5:30, she still hadn't arrived, and her coworkers started to get anxious since the broadcast was set to go live in just half an hour. When Kunz phoned this time, she got Jody's answering machine, and she ultimately served as anchor that morning. Police officers arrived at the station at around 7 a.m. and then traveled to her apartment where they found signs of foul play. Her keys, hairdryer, and shoes were lying haphazardly on the ground near her car, along with what investigators believed were drag marks. A palm print was found on the vehicle, but it was never matched to anyone. The Winnebago River was searched, as was the surrounding area with the aid of sniffer dogs, but no further evidence was uncovered. Rumors started to emerge that Jody may have been attacked and abducted by an obsessed viewer, and hence her desk at work was thoroughly searched, but no such evidence was found. With no further leads to follow, the FBI joined the investigation. It was then revealed that Jody had contacted the police 9 months before her disappearance to report that she was possibly being stalked by someone. She stated that she'd been jogging one morning when someone driving a black truck started following her around. The driver was never identified, and Jody never mentioned the incident again. Then, on the 1st of June that year, the police announced that the case was being officially investigated as an abduction. A few of Jody's neighbors reported hearing someone screaming that morning, but they never reported it or investigated. Several people also revealed that they'd seen a white van in the parking lot that morning, but had never seen it before, and hence had no idea who it belonged to. It's believed that the last person to see her was her friend, John, who told investigators that Jody had visited him on the night before she vanished. It's also known that the pair had spent some time on John's boat at times, and had done so on the weekend prior to her disappearance. Several of Jody's friends came forward to report that they believed John was obsessed with her, having gone as far as naming his boat after her, and that he may have had something to do with her abduction. But he was never officially named a suspect. It's also been suggested that a man named Tony Jackson was responsible for the crime, since he was known to be violent and was later incarcerated for assaulting several women. Amelia J. Zelko, a journalist who was better known to her friends as Molly, mysteriously disappeared in 1957, and to this day no one knows what happened to her. Some people think she was a victim of foul play, since evidence of the mob's involvement was found, but this has never been proven. At the time, Molly was the co-owner and business manager of The Spectator, a newspaper that was published in Joliet, Illinois every week. The stories featured in the paper were usually aligned with her interests, which included true crime, political corruption, organized crime, and gambling, to name but a few. On the 25th of September that year, Molly finished her work for the day and left the newspaper's offices at around 11:30 p.m. Several of her coworkers reported seeing her leaving the building and saying that she would see them in the morning. It's known that she didn't go directly home, as she stopped in at a local bar where she had a drink. The bartender would tell the police that she tipped him $50 and that she made 2 calls while she was there. He even remembered giving her $4 in change. She then left the bar, got in her car, and drove to her house, which was just a short distance away on Buell Avenue. She arrived there, parked her car in the driveway, then went inside, leaving the car's keys under the passenger seat, as she was in the habit of doing at times. When she didn't arrive for work the next day, her coworkers contacted the police, and it quickly became apparent that Molly had gone missing. Her apartment was searched, and it was discovered that she hadn't slept in her bed. A search was conducted using a helicopter, but no sign of Molly was found, and investigators started to believe that she had been abducted. When her neighbors were questioned, they reported hearing a woman screaming "no, no, no" at around 11:35 p.m., but they believed it was just a group of young people having fun. They added that they heard a car speeding away from the area about 40 minutes later at 12:15 a.m. A young boy also reported hearing screams, but stated that he saw 2 cars crossing a nearby bridge before stopping opposite of each other near a construction site on Benton Street. He then heard the same woman screaming again, followed by the sound of 2 shots, possibly from the same firearm. One of the cars then left the scene, while the other remained, and moments later, someone at the site started using a forklift. The boy's mother told him not to say anything about what he saw, but he felt that he needed to speak to the police. The only other evidence that was ever recovered were Molly's black shoes, which she had in the past told her friends she would kick off if she ever needed to run away from an attacker. The case quickly went cold, as nothing further was ever found, and only years later did a woman come forward to report that she had seen 4 men carrying something in a blanket after removing it from the trunk of a black car. A person's arm could be seen underneath the blanket, which they then proceeded to bury in an area that she described as close to Molly's home. At one point, a convict named James Reaney, who was known as the Green Hornet, confessed to ending Molly's life, but he later admitted that it was just a hoax. Since Molly had reported on corrupt politicians and officials, gangsters, and spurious public work contract bids, she made several enemies during her career, and likely ended up paying the ultimate price for attempting to expose the truth. Michel Trudeau is probably best known for being the son of the former Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, and the younger brother of Justin Trudeau, who also served as the former Prime Minister of that country. In November of 1998, he decided to go on a 3-day trip to Kokanee Glacier Park, where he and a few of his friends went skiing. The group spent 3 days on the slopes, and on the 13th of November, Michel and 3 of his friends were on a trail leading out of the park to head home. But then, tragedy struck. While on the trail, an avalanche suddenly struck and headed directly towards Michel. He bore the full brunt of the snow, which his friends say was about 3 feet high, and he was swept into a lake. His 2 friends were a short distance behind him on the trail and witnessed the entire event. They rushed over to the last spot where they saw Michel, but then another smaller avalanche hit, which dragged one of the men into the river, but only to about his waist. 2 of his friends would later state that they were originally also meant to leave with the group that day, but decided to stay at the park for another day, since the skiing conditions were very good. Had they been with the group, they may have also been swept into the water. The men who were with Michel when the avalanche struck were all rescued by helicopter, and despite suffering from hypothermia, went on to make full recoveries. But the search for Michel didn't go as smoothly. The lake was searched, but even before this was done, the RCMP speculated that Michel had drowned and that his remains would never be found. Nevertheless, a month-long search was conducted, during which nothing was found. Eventually, the Trudeau family made the tough decision to call off the search, and to this day, none of Michel's equipment or clothing has ever been recovered from the lake. Lena Kaiser may not be a household name in most countries, but in 2002 she rose to fame in Germany after participating in that country's version of the talent show Idols. In a biography that she released after her appearance on the show, she described having a difficult upbringing with a mother who'd gotten married 7 times, resulting in the pair moving around a lot. She also stated that her mother would often become abusive towards her at times when she'd been drinking, and that she would become physically violent. As a child, she trained as a dancer, and after graduating from high school, she started training as a child care worker. But in 2002, she learned that a television talent show was looking for participants, and she decided to enter. Her appearance took audiences by surprise, but thanks to her talent, she reached 3rd place overall. In 2004, she took part in the German version of the reality TV show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where she once again attained 3rd place. She also released a biographical musical film called Danielle the Magician, but it didn't make much of an impact at the box office. She then launched a marketing company called Positive Energy, and went on to release several albums, some of which saw some success in Germany. In 2011, she started hosting a show called Danielle's Bistro. She participated in the dance show Let's Dance, where she and her partner ended in 6th place, and she released her last album in 2016. She had studied acting in Berlin, and in September of 2018, decided to travel from Hamburg in Germany to New York on a cruise ship. But before she went on the trip, her father tried to dissuade her. He would later tell investigators that she'd started acting strangely in the days before setting out, and he believed that she may have been in the middle of a psychological episode. But despite his protests, Lena decided to board the ship, where her strange behavior only continued. One fellow passenger who was staying in the cabin next to hers reported that she could often be seen and heard talking to herself, but they decided not to interfere with whatever she was going through. It's believed that she created an Instagram account while on the ship, though the account was never verified, and she started uploading selfies that she had taken while aboard, but then she suddenly vanished. It was discovered that she vanished while the ship was about 115 miles from St. John's in Newfoundland, and a search was immediately organized by the Canadian Coast Guard and 2 other ships. The search was suspended the following day, since the temperature in the water was about 51 degrees, and it was certain she would not have been able to survive it for that long. Nothing further was ever found, and in 2020, a petition was filed to have Lena declared legally deceased. The petition was granted in March of 2021, and the day of her passing was listed as the 9th of September 2018, the same day she vanished. Bollywood actors are among some of the most recognizable faces in their respective countries, one of which is Raj Matani, who made his acting debut in 1975 when he appeared in a film called Kags Ki Now, which was directed by B.R. Ishara, a famous 70s director. But his acting career didn't fully take off until 1980, when he appeared in a staggering 8 films, and before long he started to gain some recognition as an actor. Soon, he started receiving offers to appear as a starring actor, usually as a protagonist with good intentions. By the 1990s, he'd started branching out into television, but due to the steady decline of his career, he started falling into a depressive state. By this time, he'd gotten married to a woman named Rupa, with whom he had 2 daughters, but his family decided to distance themselves from the spotlight and were only seen on a handful of occasions attending award ceremonies. But they were wholly supportive of his career. Following a string of films, Raj started to feel like he was being typecast, and since he started looking for more diverse roles, he struggled to find consistent acting work. His finances started to decline, and as a result, his wife and daughters decided to set out on their own. This only further contributed to his already fragile state of mind, and as his depression deepened, he was admitted to a mental asylum located in Mumbai. It isn't known how much time he spent in the facility, but in search of change, he decided to relocate to New York in 1994, in hopes that he would find work there, despite not being nearly as famous as he was back home. But then he suddenly vanished without a trace. A few witnesses came forward to report that they'd seen Raj driving a taxi cab in New York, but this was never verified, and it's been suggested that this was a case of mistaken identity. Others suggested that he was still living in New York, but that he'd started living as a recluse after failing to find work as an actor. Neither of these rumors were ever proven, and Raj's disappearance continues to baffle his friends, family, and investigators. To date, no one knows what became of Raj, or if he even remained in the US after being reported as missing. Only time will tell if Raj's fate will ever be revealed. Die-hard basketball fans will be familiar with the name John Brisker, who played for the Seattle Supersonics in the 1970s, after being a part of the Toledo Rockets and the Pittsburgh Condors teams. He was described as having a tough childhood, moving around a lot since his family struggled to afford rent. He spent much of his youth living in the projects, which he found very frustrating, but he chose to vent that frustration on the basketball court, and soon found that he had a talent for it. He was chosen for back-to-back ABA All-Star appearances in the early 70s, but was also known to be somewhat of a tough customer with an explosive temper. He would often be ejected from games for becoming too physical with his opponents, a habit that eventually earned him the moniker heavyweight champion of the ABA. But he was known to have a fondness for helping children in need, and often organized charity basketball games to raise funds for a youth basketball program. He also raised funds for sickle cell anemia research. On one occasion, he and one of his opponents got into a fight that required police assistance to break up. Even his fellow teammates were wary of his temper and did their best to avoid any kind of confrontation with him. Unfortunately, this proved to be his downfall. His continued clashes with other players, some of whom were legends by this point, and his head coach Bill Russell, resulted in Brisker receiving several fines and demotions, and before long, Russell started leaving him out of the team's starting lineup. With his problems only getting worse, his wife filed for divorce, and he was held in contempt of court after he failed to make the child support payments that he'd been ordered to make. He decided to exit the league in 1975 and had a child with his then-girlfriend, Khalila Rashad, after which he attempted to start up a business of some kind, but by all reports it failed. But he didn't give up. He started traveling back and forth to Africa in hopes that he would find a business opportunity there. And in March of 1978, he flew to Africa once more as he'd started working on an import-export venture. This was confirmed by Kalila, who stated that he called her several times while he was away, but she last heard from him on the 11th of April that year, after which he vanished without a trace. His last call was made from Kampala in Uganda, but then he went silent. When no further details about his time in Africa could be found, rumors started to swirl as to what happened to him. It was suggested that he'd started serving as a bodyguard to Idi Amin and that he lost his life while protecting him. Others didn't discount the possibility that he met Amin, but rather felt that his life may have been ended by Amin's order. There were also rumors that he'd become a prisoner of war and then had his life ended by the infamous Ugandan State Research Bureau. It's known that at this time, Amin had been told that the CIA was working against him, and hence any U.S. citizen would have been under suspicion. If Brisker really did cross paths with Amin, it's possible that he may have been seen as a spy and that he was taken into custody, never to be seen again. But there is, of course, the possibility that he simply found somewhere to settle down in Africa and chose to never contact any of his friends or family. Despite all these rumors and theories, no one knows what became of Brisker, and he was eventually declared legally deceased. Wallace D. Fard is credited as being the founder of the Nation of Islam, but despite this incredible achievement, relatively little is known about him. Those close to him say that he claimed to have been born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and that he was a member of the Quraysh tribe. He stated that he studied in England and the University of California, where he got into trouble with the law after he was caught selling prohibited substances, though no record of such an arrest has ever been found. It's known that he lived in Detroit somewhere around 1930, and that he supported himself by selling silks and raincoats. He also told people in the area that he was there to see justice and freedom delivered to the African American community. He started preaching Islamic ideals, and before long had amassed a small following among people who were struggling to get by. He then founded the Lost Found Nation of Islam, the Fruit of Islam Defense Corps, and Muslim Girls Training Corps, and the University of Islam. By now, Fard had declared himself to be a prophet, and had started making quite the name for himself among his followers. He was known to be very handsome, as he had thick black hair and eyebrows, and was usually seen wearing thick robes with a Turkish fez on his head. It's been said that he'd originally moved to the US because he planned to become a diplomat, but that he then found his true calling as a prophet of Islam. But this version of events has been refuted by the FBI. In 1932, one of his followers ended another's life in what he described as a ritual, and according to some sources, the Detroit police tried to tie him to the crime. He was driven out of the city but returned 2 years later. He was arrested during a raid on the University of Islam, which resulted in a riot breaking out. He was taken into custody along with several of his followers, but they were eventually released after being questioned. The events that followed his release have left his followers baffled for decades. It's known that he decided to leave Detroit for good, but none of his followers had any idea what became of him after that. Having made a name for himself as a spiritual leader, they found it hard to believe that he would suddenly decide to step out of the spotlight, leaving his followers to fend for themselves after promising them a better life. His absence led to several theories being suggested to explain his disappearance, one of which was that he changed his name after leaving Detroit, and that he then had gotten into trouble with the law in Indiana, after which he was handed a long prison sentence. Others think that he may have returned to the Middle East, where he continued his teachings, or that he was still running the Nation of Islam, but had decided to do so from out of the public eye, so that he could avoid any further run-ins with the law. The FBI revealed that they believe Fard to actually be a man named Wally Ford, who hailed from Hawaii and was a known criminal, but this has never been confirmed, and Fard remains missing to this day. When a politician goes missing amid political unrest in their country, speculation always runs wild, and in many cases people come up with strange conspiracy theories to explain what happened to them. The case of the disappearance of Elias Ali, the organizing secretary of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, is no different, except that no one is able to differentiate between actual events and conspiracy theory, since his disappearance is shrouded in mystery. Not much is known about the events leading up to his disappearance, but it is known that on the morning of the 18th of April 2012, Elias's car, which was being driven by a driver, was found empty in Banani, but neither he nor his driver were present. What struck the police as strange was the fact that the car's doors were left wide open, leading them to believe that a scuffle had taken place and that the two men were then abducted. When news of his disappearance was made public, Elias's wife, Tassina, stated that since he was a lawmaker, it was up to the government to find him, and the country's prime minister promised her that Elias would be located. But eventually, years passed without any word from Elias or his captors, and Tassina grew ever more frustrated with the investigation. At one point, the BNP Senior Joint Secretary General pleaded with Elias's captors to set him free, since he'd gotten word that he was a victim of a forced disappearance that was aided, at least in part, by the Indian government. He also revealed his theory on the disappearance, stating that Elias had been protesting against the construction of a dam on a nearby frontier, which was a project that was initiated by the government of India. He added that according to information that he received, Elias was not very well liked by the rulers of the time, and hence the decision was made to have him disappear, as has been done to many people in these areas over the years. He also criticized the Commission on Enforced Disappearances, stating they'd not received any new information since Elias was reported missing, and he questioned what had been done to track him down. During an interview with the news outlet, Tassina stated that the police contacted her on occasion during the first 4 or 5 months of her husband's disappearance, but that they then fell silent and never contacted her again. Tassina believes that the Bangladeshi government has forgotten about her husband, and that in reality they have no interest in finding him, since the Prime Minister didn't make good on his promise of locating him, and since he's shown very little interest in the case. Investigators have claimed, though, that they have been conducting searches on a monthly basis without any luck, and 13 years later, Elias remains missing. In September of 2024, Muriel Ganga and Emmanuel Mwambako, two Paralympic athletes hailing from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, were competing in the 2024 Paralympic Games that were held in Paris. Muriel served as the country's flag bearer, but also competed in the shot put and javelin events. As for Emmanuel, he took part in the blind sprinting event, but then the unthinkable happened when they both mysteriously disappeared. When the event opened, Muriel had been carrying the Congolese flag while performing dance moves from her wheelchair, and Emmanuel promised that he would give his all while competing in his events. After the pair was reported as missing, it was discovered that Emmanuel's guide, Sharon, had also disappeared, and the French government immediately started investigating. When other athletes at the Games were questioned, they stated that they last saw the pair on the 5th of September while spending time at the athletes' village. During the respective events, Emmanuel placed 4th in the men's 100-meter dash, while Muriel failed to make an impression in the seated javelin, ever since her throws were judged to be invalid, as she fouled 3 consecutive times. But when the time came for them to appear at the game's closing ceremony, they were suspiciously absent, and when their rooms were checked, it was discovered that their luggage was also missing. But their passports had been handed in to the Congolese delegation upon their arrival in Paris, and hence it's believed that they are still in the country, if not in Paris itself. Worryingly, they aren't the only athletes who went missing at that time. Rwandan volleyball player, 44-year-old Claudine Bazubagira, disappeared just days before the games were set to begin, and she was noticeably absent from the opening ceremony. She was last seen leaving the athletes' village on the 20th of August at around 7 p.m., stating she was going to get something to eat at a restaurant nearby. But strangely, her disappearance was only reported a week later when the president of the Rwandan Olympic Committee came forward to report that Claudine had vanished, and only then was an investigation started. It's known that Claudine left in the company of several other athletes, but they were unable to provide any further details, other than to say that they haven't seen her since, and that she didn't give any indication that anything was bothering her. Her disappearance has resulted in suggestions that she may have filed a request for political asylum in France, but this has not been proven during the resulting investigation by French police. It's also been suggested that Emmanuel and Muriel absconded from the games in an effort to avoid returning to their home country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, But without any evidence of this being found, the investigation into their disappearances, along with Sharon's, remains ongoing. Wapko Jensma is a name not many people are familiar with, since he was mostly known in his native country of South Africa before he mysteriously vanished. But today, his work as a poet, artist, and writer is celebrated by many of his fans and other artists in that country. His work has been described by some as transcending racial and language barriers, since he wrote in both English and Afrikaans, and upon meeting him, many of his peers were surprised to discover that he was Caucasian. Jensma was born in Ventersdorp in South Africa in 1939. His father was a Dutch immigrant who relocated to the country in 1928, and he grew up with 2 siblings, a brother and a sister. The family relocated to Middelburg in the Eastern Cape while he was still young, as his father had landed a job at the local College of Agriculture. As a high school student, he enjoyed playing rugby and later used a newspaper clipping of a report on his winning try against a neighboring school as the cover of one of his poetry collections, called I Must Show You My Clippings. He studied at university but had to take some time off from his studies after he was involved in a motorbike accident. He then enrolled at the Botshabelo Training College and the University of Pretoria, where he obtained a bachelor's degree in fine arts with his major being sculpture. In his free time, he worked as a magazine editor and translator, but also took time to travel to different African countries. His mother passed away in 1948, after which his father remarried a woman named Francina Kotze. In his adult years, he started writing poetry and producing linoleum-printed artworks depicting strange animals that had human-like qualities. Those who appreciated his poetry described it as jazz-like, and he would later describe the words that he used as his jazz instrument, and his expression serving as his rhythm. His work has proven to be divisive, as some respected artists sing his praises, while others consider it to be flawed and unpolished. He was known to have a serious hatred of the then apartheid government that ruled the country, a fact that's often palpable in his poetry, such as the piece entitled Once and Now. At least one of his other poems, written in 1977, was banned in the country for this very reason. But today, it's freely available, since that government is no longer at the helm. From the outside, it seemed as though Jensma was living his idyllic life, but in reality, he was struggling with mental health as he got older. When he realized that he needed help, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and from there suffered a slow but steady decline. His artistic skills started to wane, and before long he was living on the streets of Johannesburg, and his friends and family became concerned for his safety. He eventually started living in a Salvation Army men's home, and he was cared for and taken for weekly trips to visit a doctor. On one occasion in 1993, he was taken to the doctor by a Salvation Army driver, but when the time came for him to return, the driver couldn't find him. Other shelters and mental institutions were checked, but they had no record of him, and he remains missing to this day. On the 7th of November, 1974, a mystery unfolded that shook London, England to its core. And while the culprit has been identified, his location remains unknown. Some people believe he may still be alive more than half a decade later, but this has never been proven. On that day, the estranged wife of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, ran into a pub in the city covered in biological material, and she had a surprise tale to tell. She claimed that her husband had ended the life of her nanny. Veronica Mary Duncan and Bingham met through one of his friends, and they got married in 1963. Not long after this, his father passed away, and he took over his title as Earl of Lucan. They would go on to have 3 children together, but the marriage quickly started deteriorating due to the fact that Veronica was suffering from postnatal depression. Before they became estranged in 1974, Bingham tried to have Veronica sent to a psychiatric facility, but before he could do so, they separated. He was of the opinion that she was unfit to be a mother to their children, and as a result, they became embroiled in a bitter custody battle. He ultimately lost the case, and as a result, he was liable for massive amounts of court fees. Veronica moved to Lower Belgrave Street, and at 9:45 p.m. on the 7th of October that year, she entered a pub close to her home with the news that her children's nanny, Sandra Rivet, had been attacked, losing her life in the process. She stated that she'd only just managed to escape from Bingham, and that he was still inside the house when she fled. She stated that at around 9 p.m., she'd asked Sandra for a cup of tea, and Sandra went down to the house's basement where one of the kitchens was located. When she failed to come back upstairs, Veronica decided to investigate, and there she found that the nanny had been attacked by a man whose voice, in her opinion, was unmistakably Bingham's. When she finally caught sight of him, an altercation broke out, during which he claimed to have ended Sandra's life by accident. He then took Veronica back up to her bedroom, but on the way there, she managed to break free of his grasp and escape to the pub. The police were called, and when they entered the house, they found Sandra, as described, next to a lead pipe that had been used during the attack. Bingham was nowhere to be seen, and it was later learned that he'd fled to Uckfield in Sussex, where he hid out at a friend's house. His friend, a man named Ian Maxwell Scott, was not home when Bingham arrived, but he was greeted by Scott's wife, Susan. He then told her what had happened that night in his own words, stating that the entire incident stemmed from a series of unfortunate coincidences. He claimed to have walked past Veronica's house that night when he noticed that she was being attacked by someone in the basement, and when he ran into the house to intervene, the man fled. He then realized that it wasn't Veronica who was attacked, but Sandra, and realizing that if Veronica saw him there, she would assume that he'd ended her life, well, that's exactly what happened. He felt he only had one option: to leave London so that he could lie low for a while. The following day, he left his friend's house, not saying where he was heading, and he disappeared. No one ever reported spotting him again after this, and despite claims by his family that he may still be alive today, most people assume that he has since passed away, and that we will never learn where he went after fleeing that morning. Bill Tillman is considered by many to be one of the greatest explorers of the 20th century. He was known to possess an iron will, stopping at nothing to explore areas that he found fascinating. While this is certainly an admirable trait, it's thought that this was the very strength of will that led to his disappearance in 1977, when he was 80 years old. But before he disappeared, he lived a remarkable life that saw him fight in not just one, but both world wars. Harold William Tillman, known to his friends as Bill, was born in Cheshire, England in 1898. His father John hailed from Liverpool and worked as a sugar merchant, while his mother Adeline raised the couple's children at home. Bill started his school career in New Brighton, but would eventually study at the prestigious Berkhamsted, where he excelled and served as a prefect. He was told that he would almost certainly receive a college scholarship, but before he did, the First World War broke out. He served as a second lieutenant in the Royal Field Artillery at the age of 17, but since he was still a minor, he was not allowed to fight in the battle. But as the war intensified, a shortage of soldiers resulted in Bill being sent to France. Quite unbelievably, he was wounded on several occasions, but never sent home. He was eventually awarded the Military Cross. He left the military in 1919, but decided not to attend college, and instead he traveled to Kenya, where he bought a piece of land. He started farming and proved to have a talent for it, but he became discontent as farming had started boring him. He and mountaineer Eric Shipman left the area and began several hiking excursions together in the mountains. Upon his return in 1932, he sold his land and traveled back to England. The following year, he traveled back to Kenya, where he searched for gold, but found none and caught a ship back home after cycling thousands of miles to board it. He then explored India, and when he attempted to summit Mount Everest, his plans were disrupted by the Second World War, in which he served in Africa, Albania, Italy, Iran, and Iraq. Following this, he climbed a few more mountains but never made it to the top of Everest. But in 1950, he'd started to slow down due to his age, and rather than climb mountains, he took to the oceans. He bought a vessel called Mischief in 1954, after which he circumnavigated Africa, the South Atlantic, as well as East and West Greenland. At the age of 80, he undertook one more voyage in the company of a young explorer called Simon Richardson, aboard a vessel called the En Avant, and several of his friends reported receiving letters from him during this time. But one day, they stopped arriving, and Bill was never seen or heard from again. The En Avant was never found, and it's believed that it sank somewhere in the South Atlantic Ocean. No trace of Bill was ever found, and it's assumed that he perished at sea, but this remains only a theory, and his fate may never be known. Well-known restaurateur Chuck Moore is thought to be a victim of the Bermuda Triangle, since his disappearance, along with that of his wife and another couple, has never been solved, but it's known that they were sailing from the Bahamas to Florida when they suddenly vanished. Chuck and his wife Betty were the owners of more than 20 restaurants in Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and Michigan. Chuck had decided that he wanted to build a series of upscale but relaxed seafood restaurants in waterfront locations in different areas of the U.S. His staff members described him as an easygoing guy who thought of them as family. They added that all of the recipes used in these restaurants came from Chuck's family, and by all accounts, the food that they served was really good. According to Florida locals, the best dishes on the menu were the gazpacho, coleslaw, fish pate, and black bean soup. It's even been rumored that Chuck's gazpacho recipe was stolen by one of his employees, who then sold it to CR Chicks. His restaurants proved to be so popular that they raked in an impressive $60 million every year, and it's safe to say that Chuck and Betty no longer needed to worry about their finances. In March of 1993, the couple, along with their friends, George and Lynn Drummy, had been spending time in the Bahamas, but on the 10th of March, they decided to return to Florida, where they planned to attend a party. They were in a rush to board Chuck's 40-foot boat named Charlie's Crab, since a storm was heading their way and they wanted to make it to the mainland before it hit. When they set out that day, the weather was clear and calm, but 2 days later, they were facing 30-foot waves and struggling to make headway. Then at 4:25 a.m. on the 13th of March, a 911 operator in Palm Beach County received a call from someone aboard the boat, but could only hear static on the line. They received another call 2 minutes later, but again they were unable to speak to anyone, as nothing but static could be heard. Crew members who were conducting a routine patrol aboard a Coast Guard Falcon jet would later report seeing the Charlie's Crab as it was heading towards the Great Isaac Light from the direction of Chub Cay. And at that point, the two couples were still headed in the right direction. George Drummy's son would also report that he last heard from his father on the 2nd of March, when he checked in to report that they were in Nassau. When it was discovered that the vessel was missing, search efforts were hampered by the fact that no one knew where it had gone down. Many sailors in the area stated that they didn't expect such a massive storm, since forecasts from the previous day led them to believe that there would be some rain and wind, but when winds of up to 80 knots started blowing, they knew that any vessel still on the water would be in trouble. The Coast Guard scoured 36,000 square miles of ocean, but never found a single piece of wreckage. Since the Gulf Stream flows through that area, it may have been carried off elsewhere and eventually settled at the bottom of the ocean. The search was eventually called off, and it's believed that the four friends lost their lives in the sea that day, and only time will tell if any evidence of this will ever be found. Sebastian of Portugal became king of that country in 1557 at the age of 3, when he succeeded the throne after the passing of his grandfather, Dom João III of Portugal. He was obviously too young to rule, and so only took up that responsibility in 1568 at the age of 14. He was a stout religious person who believed that he was meant to become a soldier of God, and that he would be the one to drive the Muslim faith out of North Africa. 8 years later, a conflict broke out over the throne of Morocco, and Sebastian saw this as the perfect opportunity to travel to Africa on a crusade. The commanders of his army had advised him against the attack, informing him that the opposite side had 10 times as many soldiers as his army, but he decided to ignore their advice and ordered the attack anyway. It was assumed that Sebastian lost his life on the battlefield that day, but with no way to prove this, the people of Portugal started to believe he may still be alive, and that he would return one day to sit on the throne once more. In the meantime, his uncle served as king, but as he was already of old age, King Philip of Spain eventually took over. Still, the public waited for Sebastian's return, and on several occasions different men arrived in the country, claiming to be the lost king, who had returned to reclaim his rightful place on the throne. But they were all eventually found to be imposters, hoping to take advantage of the king's disappearance. King Philip claimed to have found Sebastian's remains in 1582, and stated that he'd given him a proper burial, but most people believe this to be a ruse, since such an event would make Philip's claims to the throne much stronger. To this day, many people in Portugal still believe that he will return to the country on a foggy morning when Portugal needs him the most, which would mean that he'd somehow gained immortality. But perhaps this is easier to accept than the fact that one of Portugal's most beloved kings perished while on a fool's errand, and that he simply lost his life while pursuing his greatest passion. Earl Wintermute, known to his friends and family and fans as Slim, was a very gifted basketball player who at 6'8" stood taller than any other player in the U.S. West Coast. He was known to be an excellent defensive player and surprised many people with his ability to shoot from outside the three-point arc, despite playing as a center. Slim was born in Portland, Oregon in July of 1917, but he spent most of his childhood growing up in Longview, Washington, where he lived with his parents, Peter and Iva. He grew taller than the rest of his classmates while he was still young, and it soon became clear that he would excel at basketball. Despite his height, he was surprisingly agile and coupled this with serious aggression while competing, a trait that earned him the respect and admiration of his teammates. He could also move quickly, which took his opponents by surprise. In 1938, he started playing for the University of Oregon team called the Ducks, also known as the Tall Firs. With Slim on their team, the Ducks managed to win their first ever NCAA tournament championship when they defeated Texas, Oklahoma, and Ohio State. Following this, he was included in the All-Pacific Coast Conference first team, and in 1939, he was named an All-American. When he eventually made it to the NBA, he played for the Detroit Eagles. Basketball coach Howard Hobson once described Slim as the best center in the country while he was still playing, and added that he was the best defensive center that he had ever coached, and the best that he'd ever seen in collegiate basketball. He continued to play basketball until 1953, after which he retired from the game and moved to Lake Oswego in Oregon, where he started a family. For a short while, he worked at a car dealership, but eventually struck out on his own to open a leasing company. But he was, however, forced to close this business after he suffered a heart attack, and he then moved to Seattle, where he started working for the Boeing Corporation. Those sources don't state what position he held there. He remained employed with the company until 1977, when he suddenly disappeared, and he was never heard from again. On the 21st of October, 1977, at the age of 60, he called his manager and stated he'd be taking the day off of work. He developed an interest in sailing and had bought a yacht, which he decided he would be taking out on the water that day. He and one of his friends launched the vessel from the Seattle Yacht Club in Portage Bay just after 7 a.m. that morning. They intended to spend the day out on Union Lake, but it then suddenly vanished. It isn't known whether the two men were reported missing, but according to some sources, it was investigators who came across the yacht while it was adrift close to the Hunts Point area of Lake Washington. It was found at about 2 p.m. that same afternoon, and when they boarded the yacht, Slim was nowhere to be found. But they did locate his friend, who was asleep, and when they woke him up, he was surprised to learn that Slim was no longer aboard. He stated that when he decided to take a nap, Slim was still at the helm, and he had no idea what had happened to him. Slim's disappearance wasn't seen as suspicious, and it was assumed that he'd had another heart attack or had suffered a different medical emergency and had fallen overboard. This was never proven, as his remains have never been found, despite divers and his son scouring the lake bottom. Slim was inducted into the Oregon Sports Hall of Fame in 1980, and many fans still wonder what happened on that day that he vanished forever. Barbara Follett had a passion for writing from a very young age. She would often hear her father typing away at his typewriter while he was locked in his study. But when she was just 4 years old, she snuck into the study and carried the typewriter to her bedroom to start working on her own stories. She started reading long before the rest of children her age, but was also known to be fond of the outdoors. And in the years that followed, she composed several poems about nature and the animals that she encountered. Barbara was born in Hanover, New Hampshire, England in 1914, and her parents encouraged her to pursue her writing talent as soon as they noticed it. She fell in love with the stories that she read in books, and by all accounts, her life was always going to lead her to become a novelist. But this prediction came true much earlier than anyone predicted. When she was young, she made a habit of giving her mother a gift when it was her own birthday, and when she was about to turn 8, she decided that that gift should be a book. She spent several weeks writing in her room, using her father's typewriter to complete the story, which was about a child who was lost in the wilderness. She titled it The House Without Windows. Unfortunately, a few days after she'd finished the tale, a fire broke out in the family's home and most of their belongings were destroyed, along with Barbara's gift to her mother. She refused to accept defeat, though, and quickly started rewriting it word for word from memory. This process took 3 years to complete, since she sometimes took a break from the story for a few months, but out of frustration and determination, she kept at it until it was finished again. She had abandoned the idea of writing it from memory and instead included new details as she thought of them. The story follows a girl named Ipersip who runs away from home after she becomes frustrated with living in the city. Her love for the outdoors leads her to a meadow, then the ocean, and eventually the mountains, where she then lives the way that she always dreamed of, free and without restrictions. She finished the tale at the age of 12, and upon reading it, her father knew it was something special. So he took it to Alfred Knopf, the publisher with whom he worked. Knopf decided to make 2,500 copies of Barbara's story, and in a very short time, they were all sold. The book was labeled as a bestseller, and Barbara was from that day on considered to be a child prodigy. She was soon photographed alongside some of her favorite authors, not as a fan, but as one of their peers. She made radio appearances and started writing reviews on other authors' books, and before long, her name became well known. But she soon started writing again after she had an idea for a book about pirates on the open sea, and at age 13 she completed her book, The Voyage of the Norman D. She married a man named Nickerson Rogers, whom she met at age 18 while hiking the Appalachian Trail. When her writing dreams started to wane after having to start a different job, she became frustrated and left her apartment on the 7th of December, 1939. She took a few dollars with her and was never seen again. One of her friends told investigators that Barbara once joked that if she were unable to succeed as a writer, she would simply disappear. No evidence was ever found to indicate where she went, and no one ever heard from her again. The famous Swedish director, 42-year-old Daniel Lind Lagerlöf, started his career as an assistant at a television station, but it didn't take long before he was able to direct his first film, The Performance, in 1990. Following this, he returned to television in 1997, where he worked on a drama show called The Archipelago Doctor, and over the course of its 18 episodes, it became a favorite among Swedish and Norwegian viewers. He directed a few more films over the following years, before returning to television once again, and during this time he completed his work on the miniseries called The Library Thief. This series, among others, was produced from a script that was written by his wife, Malin, but would be his last before he disappeared in October of 2011. At the time, Daniel was on the Swedish West Coast, where he was scouting for locations where he could film scenes for a film and TV adaptation of the Hjällbacka murders. He and 2 members of his crew were looking for locations in Hjällbacka, and had traveled to the set of cliffs in the area when they decided to split up to cover more ground. They agreed to meet up at a certain spot again later, but when Daniel didn't return, the crew members started to worry. The weather was particularly bad that day, with high winds causing huge waves in the sea below, and fearing that he may have suffered an accident, they contacted the police. A search was immediately started, and for the next 2 days, searchers scoured the cliffs and the water below, but were unable to find any trace of Daniel. Search dogs and helicopters were then brought in to aid the effort, but the dogs were unable to track his scent, and no sign of him or his clothing was ever seen in the area. After 2 days of searching, it was announced that the chances of finding Daniel alive were 0, and the search was halted. Most people believe that he either slipped on a rock while out on the cliffs, and that he ended up in the water, where thanks to the high waves he was unable to make his way back to shore, or that he suffered a medical issue with the same result. But investigators did state that if any new information is found, the case will be investigated. But to date, no one has come forward with such information, or any new evidence of his whereabouts. Strangely, while searching for Daniel, police found a set of remains, but stated that they belonged to someone else, and Daniel's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.